In 1915, construction workers unearthed 6 bodies hidden beneath the foundation of an old house in rural North Dakota. To this day, none have been positively identified. This story will take you from Niagara, New York to Niagara, North Dakota, where we will venture into insane asylums, flooded county buildings, and vast farmland. This is the tale of the Great Plains Butcher, also known as the Midnight Rider. Among the dead discovered on that June day in 1915 near Niagara, North Dakota, were what authorities suspected to be a family of 5 and 1 adult male killed some years later. The owner of the farm in 1915 would have been undoubtedly horrified by the grisly discovery, but it was certainly not he who was suspected. To learn more about the man behind the murders, we must first travel to Niagara County, New York. The Butlers were a large farming family in Niagara, New York. Ephraim and Rebecca Butler had 5 children, and although Ephraim passed away prematurely at age 48, Rebecca would live to see her 70s. The 5 children consisted of 4 boys and 1 girl: Oscar, Eugene, Orzello, Luella, and Frank from eldest to youngest. The children were born between the years of 1844 and 1855. By 1870, several years after the loss of Ephraim, the family would be largely split up, with only Oscar, his new wife Mary, 2 children, and brother Eugene living under one roof in the state of New York. A decade later, in 1880, census records would indicate Orzello Butler would be living as a painter and taking care of his elderly mother Rebecca and younger sister Luella. At this time, Luella was yet unmarried and 26 years of age, with no children and working in a shirt factory. Meanwhile, eldest brother Oscar also lived in Niagara County with a wife and 3 children. Frank, the youngest, was married and working on a family of his own in New York State. Still predominantly in Niagara County, New York, one of the Butler boys would eventually make his way to Niagara, North Dakota, to brutally murder 6 people. That boy, now a man of approximately 40 years of age, would be Eugene Butler. Between 1870 and 1890, historic records are sparse as to what Eugene's affairs were. One thing is certain, those affairs did not involve a wife or a family. They solely focused on farming. Newspaper accounts state Eugene eventually moved to North Dakota around 1880 with a party of other New Yorkers seeking to homestead in the vast lands of North Dakota. By 1900, census records show him living alone, age 51, in Niagara, North Dakota. Although the name is the same, it is a long way from his childhood home in Niagara County, New York. During his time in North Dakota, Eugene would continue farming and was known to be quite wealthy. He was also known for being a recluse, eccentric, and eventually extremely paranoid. His behavior would attract enough attention to eventually force his involuntary commitment to an insane asylum in nearby Jamestown, North Dakota. At the time he was committed, one newspaper stated he was the wealthiest man ever sent to the asylum at Jamestown. It also claimed Eugene was delusional in his belief that all the old maids and widows in the country wanted to marry him. The newspaper stated the value of his holdings was $50,000 at the time he was involuntarily committed. $50,000 in 1904 is the equivalent in purchasing power to about $1,400,000 today. Townspeople recalled Butler would ride rapidly at night across the country, often screaming at the top of his lungs as he rode a horse. Thus, he was dubbed the Midnight Rider. Also known at the time was his paranoia that he was being persecuted by persons unknown. But although Eugene was a man of monetary wealth, his material living conditions at his farmhouse were sparse. In 1904, a newspaper reported that neighbors believed he would be better cared for in Jamestown. At that time, it was stated he owned over 400 acres, but the house was a perfect shell, and an antiquated cook stove was all that was found in the shape of a heating plant to keep the old shell warm. There were but few articles of furniture, and the whole surroundings would indicate that the owner of the farm had indulged in mighty few luxuries. In addition to the 400 acres, Eugene had 19 head of cattle, 9 horses, and 700 bushels of wheat. The newspaper goes on to say, the hired man was found in charge, and when he found that his employer had been sent to the asylum, he very promptly refused to remain longer unless he was provided with a more modern stove and some other necessities to make life worth living. But the poor conditions of his house were not for lack of funds. It was reported over $3,000 of cash, checks, and certificates of deposits were found hidden away in the farmhouse. $3,000 in 1904 is the equivalent to about $87,000 today. His exact psychological diagnosis is not known, but what is known today are the horrid living conditions within the asylum at the time of his commitment. Also known as the North Dakota Hospital for the Insane, it was opened on May 1st of 1885. By the end of 1886, the average daily census was 106 patients. But by 1892, conditions at the hospital were so crowded that the attics were used for sleeping rooms, and even then, patients had to sleep two to a bed. The year Butler was committed, in 1904, the census had risen to an average of 401 patients, and there were still no additional buildings. The census continued to rise, leaping from 538 in 1908 to 819 in 1912, and then to 1,288 by 1920. To give you an idea of how badly conditions would continue to deteriorate, by 1956, long after the death of Eugene Butler, one person reported that finally, gone are the cages, straitjackets, leg irons, stern guards, malnutrition, windowless seclusion rooms, unorganized apartments, the 60-hour work week, the naked despondent patient on the back ward, the odors from wards crammed with untidy and helpless men and women, the tuberculosis patients in disorganized treatment areas, the neglected surgical problems in the bedlam of disturbed units. One can imagine the overcrowded conditions of 1904, the year Butler was committed, when the facilities were built for just over 100 individuals, yet housed over 400. During this time at the asylum, Eugene had a mortal fear that having his picture taken would result in his death. It is unknown if he had his picture taken at any time, but what is known is that he died of phlebitis on October 22nd in 1911 at 62 years of age. Regarding the cause of Eugene's death, phlebitis is inflammation of a vein. Phlebitis may occur with or without a blood clot. Trauma to the vein, for instance from an intravenous catheter, is a possible cause. Given the state of the Jamestown Asylum and overcrowding in 1910, it is possible medical malpractice could have indeed brought about his early demise. After his death, the superintendent from the hospital would remark on his behavior, stating during the 6 years that he was confined to the asylum for the insane, he gave trouble only at isolated periods, although he frequently made complaint to the asylum officials that they were after him. It is interesting to note that one modern researcher, Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist at Columbia University who maintains a database of 350 mass killers going back more than a century, has concluded 65% of mass killers exhibited no evidence of a severe mental disorder. 22% likely had psychosis, the delusional thinking and hallucinations that characterize schizophrenia, or sometimes accompany mania and severe depression. 4 years after the death of Eugene Butler, a 1915 newspaper states a workman was excavating for a basement under the former Butler home. He first unearthed the body of a lone victim which had been concealed under about 3 feet of dirt under the middle of the home. The body had been dropped into its place of concealment through a hole cut in the floor. The other 5 bodies were buried in a hole that was dug from the outside of the house, under the foundation. The hole into which these bodies were dumped was sloping in nature, and while time may have rotted the bones, there are indications that in order to hide the crime, Butler was compelled to break the legs of at least 2 of his victims. The foundation wall where the bodies had been buried was disturbed after its construction, which was about 20 years ago. That fact limits the period within which the murders occurred. In order to bury the victims, the 3 bottom stones of the foundation wall were loosened. In refilling the hole, black dirt was thrown in, and the manner in which the burial place was dug indicated by the marked lines of distinction between the black dirt used as covering and the red clay subsoil. Also interesting to note, none of the victims were buried with any trace of clothing. The paper goes on to say, the dirt about the skeletons was carefully examined for trace of buttons, shoes, etc., but nothing was found, indicating that the bodies have been buried nude. Examination of the skull of the single victim, and probably the most recent murder victim, indicates the man had a crooked nose, the nasal bone being slightly bent towards the left. Each body was killed in the same manner with some sharp instrument used in the killing of the 6 victims. It was stated, There is a sharp and clearly defined hole in the left side of the skull of each. The skull of the single victim is similarly marked. But what led Eugene to kill 6 people, crush their skulls, and break their legs to fit in a hole under a house? And more importantly, who were these people? We may never know the true answer to this. Theories abound as to the identities, and one popular belief at the time was that he had killed a visiting relative. Due to newspaper records regarding the settling of his estate after his death and before the discovery of the murders, we know his brothers were all living at the time. His sister Luella was reported as deceased after being adjudged insane. Therefore, it is unlikely any of the bodies found on the property were of the Butler family tree. Only one newspaper followed up on the deaths and put forth a singular theory. The newspaper stated, Sheriff A.F. Turner and Coroner R. McLean have made a thorough investigation and feel reasonably confident that the persons killed include a Negro, who was the last servant to be employed by Butler, and 2 former housekeepers and their children. Only one person came forward to report a missing relative. In July of 1915, Leo Urbaski of Long Prairie, Minnesota, believed Butler may have murdered his brother. He reported his brother as having arrived in Niagara, North Dakota in the summer of 1902 and took employment from a bachelor farmer near there. Since that day, he was never heard from again. Unfortunately, this is where the trail runs cold. Today, the skeletons are missing. No active leads persist, and the case records are believed to have been destroyed a number of years ago when the local courthouse flooded. Although the current sheriff is well aware of the case, it is unlikely it will ever be solved unless the remains of the deceased individuals can be recovered and tested with the latest DNA techniques. This has been the story of the Great Plains Butcher, also known as the Midnight Rider, or Eugene Butler, North Dakota's first and only known serial killer. Join us for more interesting stories, mini-documentaries, and exploring abandoned places on decadence and decay.